"So, Emily, what exactly do you do these days?" Daniel Brooks asked the question with the casual smile of someone who already believed he knew the answer, and the soft clinking of wine glasses around the long reunion table made the moment feel lighter than it really was. But Emily Carter recognized the tone immediately, because 10 years earlier it had been the same tone he used when he told her she would never keep up with the life he wanted. The rooftop terrace overlooked the glowing Seattle skyline, and warm lights hung from thin cables above their old college classmates who were now trading stories about startups, promotions, and new homes in neighborhoods with names everyone recognized. Emily sat quietly among them, her dark coat folded over the back of her chair, her posture calm, her hands wrapped loosely around a simple glass of sparkling water. Across from her, Daniel leaned back in his chair like the host of the evening, even though he had only arrived 20 minutes earlier with his polished confidence and his elegant wife Sophia Blake beside him, Sophia's diamond bracelet catching the light every time she lifted her hand to brush her hair away from her face. Several people at the table turned toward Emily, curious now, waiting for her answer the way people wait for a small reveal in a story they assume will be predictable. Daniel tilted his head slightly, pretending to be patient. Emily looked at him for a moment, and in that second the city lights reflected faintly in her eyes. "I live quietly," she said. The table went silent for half a heartbeat before a few people chuckled politely, the kind of laugh meant to keep the mood comfortable. Daniel let out a soft laugh of his own and raised his glass. "Still the same, Emily," he said lightly, glancing around at the others. "I guess some people never really moved up." Sophia smiled in a way that wasn't cruel exactly, but close enough that Emily felt the familiar echo of an old memory. A breeze moved across the rooftop terrace, carrying the faint scent of the ocean from the bay and rustling the linen tablecloths. Emily didn't argue. She didn't correct him. She simply took a small sip of her drink while the conversation shifted back towards someone's new tech company and another person's luxury condo downtown. Daniel was already talking again, describing an investment deal his firm was preparing to sign the following month, something about a massive resort development outside the city that would transform an entire stretch of coastal property. Heads nodded around the table as people leaned closer, impressed. Emily listened quietly, her expression calm, almost thoughtful. None of them noticed the brief glance she gave toward the glass wall of the rooftop restaurant where a discreet plaque near the entrance reflected the lights of the room. The plaque carried the name of the company that had purchased the building 3 years earlier, the same company that had quietly acquired the land beneath the upcoming resort project Daniel was so proud of negotiating. Carter Holdings. Inside the warm glow of the terrace, Daniel laughed again, confident and relaxed, completely certain he understood the life Emily Carter had ended up living after their divorce. And for the moment, Emily let him believe it. The reunion ended late that night, and the quiet streets of Seattle were nearly empty when Daniel Brooks drove home, the glow of downtown fading behind him in the rearview mirror while the echo of the evening still lingered in his mind. It was not Emily's answer that stayed with him. It was the calm way she said it, the same steady voice she used years ago when she insisted that life did not have to be loud to be meaningful. Daniel had dismissed that idea then, and tonight he dismissed it again with a small shake of his head as he pulled into the driveway of his modern glass house overlooking Lake Washington. The next morning began the way most of Daniel's mornings did, with a strong cup of coffee, a tablet full of financial updates, and a stack of emails waiting for his attention. His firm had been negotiating a massive resort investment along the northern coastline, a project worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and Daniel had spent the past 6 months helping lead the deal. He felt confident about it. The location was perfect, the investors were ready, and the property owners had seemed eager to sell. But halfway through his coffee, one email stopped him cold. The subject line read "Urgent update regarding coastal acquisition." Daniel opened the message and read the first line twice before he fully understood what it meant. The land had already been purchased, not by a competitor he recognized, not by a corporation he had heard rumors about. The buyer listed in the official filing was a private investment group called Carter Holdings. Daniel leaned back slowly in his chair, his brow tightening as he scrolled through the attached documents. Carter Holdings had completed the acquisition late the previous evening, only hours after the reunion dinner had ended. The purchase covered every parcel of land surrounding the future resort development, including the very shoreline Daniel's investors had planned to build upon. He tapped the screen again, pulling up the ownership registry. The company had remained quiet for years, purchasing properties across Washington state without drawing attention, but now the name appeared everywhere across the development zone like a signature written across the map. Daniel frowned, searching for the executive leadership information. The page loaded slowly, revealing the registered managing director of Carter Holdings. For a moment Daniel thought he had misread the name. He leaned closer to the screen. Emily Carter. The room felt strangely quiet after that. Outside the wide windows of his home, the lake shimmered in the pale morning light, boats drifting slowly across the water, while Daniel sat motionless with the tablet still in his hands. Emily Carter. The same Emily who sat quietly at the reunion table the night before while everyone laughed politely at her answer. The same Emily who said she lived quietly. Daniel exhaled slowly and stood from his chair, walking to the window as if distance might help him think more clearly. It had to be coincidence, he told himself at first. Carter was a common name. But as he opened the full property report, the address of the company headquarters appeared beneath the ownership records. The location was not an office tower downtown or a corporate campus in Bellevue. It was a private estate on a hillside overlooking the entire city. Daniel stared at the address for several seconds before something deeper than curiosity settled in his chest. By the time he reached for his car keys, he was no longer certain that the quiet life Emily had described the night before was the life he had imagined. Daniel Brooks had driven across half the city before he fully realized where the navigation system was leading him. The roads gradually climbed higher above Seattle, winding through quiet neighborhoods where the houses were set far back from the street, and the trees stood tall enough to hide entire estates behind them. The address on the property report had seemed almost unreal when he first read it that morning, but now the street signs matched perfectly with the location on his tablet. Carter Holdings. Daniel slowed his car as the road curved upward along a hillside that overlooked the entire skyline. From this height, the city looked smaller, almost peaceful, the towers reflecting sunlight across Elliott Bay, while sailboats moved slowly across the water like white brushstrokes. But Daniel was not looking at the view anymore. Ahead of him stood a long iron gate set into a stone wall that stretched along the edge of a massive property. A polished plaque near the entrance carried a single understated name engraved in dark metal. Carter Estate. Daniel pulled his car to a stop beside the gate, staring at the letters for several seconds as if they might rearrange themselves into something more familiar. The estate beyond the wall was partially visible through the tall trees, but what he could see was enough to silence every assumption he had carried since the reunion the night before. A wide driveway curved up the hill through perfectly trimmed gardens, and farther in the distance a large house stood overlooking the water, its glass windows catching the morning sun. The place was not just a mansion. It was the kind of property people described in business magazines when they talked about quiet billionaires who preferred privacy over attention. Daniel stepped out of the car slowly, gravel crunching under his shoes as he approached the gate. For a moment he wondered if he had misunderstood everything. Maybe Emily worked for the company. Maybe she managed the property. But before he could convince himself of that explanation, the gate moved. The iron panels slid open smoothly with the soft mechanical sound of a hidden motor. Daniel looked up. A black sedan was already parked halfway up the driveway, and standing near the entrance steps of the house was a familiar figure holding a white coffee cup in one hand. Emily Carter. She was dressed simply in a light sweater and dark jeans, her hair tied back loosely the way it had been during their early years together. From this distance, she looked exactly like the quiet woman who sat across from him at the reunion table. Yet everything around her told a completely different story. The driveway stretched nearly a quarter mile behind Daniel, lined with tall cedar trees and modern sculptures placed carefully along the path. Beyond the house, he could see the edge of an infinity pool reflecting the sky, and further down the slope private terraces stepped toward the water like layers of a hidden resort. Emily noticed him standing near the gate and took a slow sip of her coffee before walking down a few steps toward the driveway. She did not look surprised to see him. Daniel opened his mouth to speak, but the words took a moment to come. "Emily, is this your place?" he finally asked, his voice quieter than he expected. Emily glanced briefly toward the city skyline beyond the property and then back at him, her expression calm, almost thoughtful. Yes, she said gently. Daniel stared at the house again, trying to connect the reality in front of him with the woman he thought he understood. The quiet life she mentioned the night before suddenly carried a completely different meaning. Emily watched him for a moment, then offered a small, peaceful smile before turning back toward the house as the gate slowly closed behind him. Daniel remained standing just inside the gate as it closed behind him with a quiet mechanical sound that seemed louder than it really was. For a moment, he simply watched Emily walking back toward the wide stone steps of the house, the morning sun stretching long shadows across the driveway, while the breeze moved gently through the tall cedar trees lining the property. Everything about the place felt calm and deliberate, as if every inch of the estate had been designed for someone who valued silence more than attention. Daniel finally stepped forward, following the curve of the driveway that led toward the entrance. The gravel shifted under his shoes, each step reminding him that the property surrounding him was far larger than it first appeared from the road. It had to be at least 15 acres, maybe more, with terrace gardens descending toward the water and a private dock barely visible in the distance along the shoreline. When he reached the base of the steps, Emily was waiting there, leaning lightly against the railing with the same relaxed posture she had always carried even during the most stressful moments of their past. She took another sip of her coffee and studied him quietly for a few seconds before speaking. "You drove all the way up here this early," she said gently. "That must mean the documents reached you faster than I expected." Daniel blinked in surprise. "You knew I would see them." Emily nodded once. "Your firm has been negotiating that coastal project for months. When Carter Holdings completed the purchase last night, it was only a matter of time before your team discovered the change." Daniel looked back over his shoulder toward the long driveway and the closed gate at the bottom of the hill. "So the land, all of it belongs to you." Emily tilted her head slightly. "It belongs to the company. But yes, I oversee the investments." The calm simplicity of her answer left Daniel momentarily speechless. The woman he remembered from their marriage had always been thoughtful and capable, but he had never imagined a world where she quietly controlled property deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars. "Why did you not say anything last night?" he asked finally. Emily gave a small smile that carried neither pride nor resentment. "Because no one asked the right question." She turned and walked a few steps up toward the terrace that overlooked the city, gesturing lightly for him to follow. From the top of the stairs, the entire skyline spread out below them, glass towers shining in the sunlight, while ferries moved slowly across the blue water of the bay. Daniel stood beside her in silence, still trying to reconcile the memory of the quiet woman at the reunion table with the reality surrounding him now. Emily rested her coffee cup on the stone railing and looked out at the view as if it were the most ordinary sight in the world. "You said something interesting last night," she said after a moment. "You told everyone that some people never moved up." Daniel shifted uncomfortably, remembering the laughter that followed his comment. Emily did not look at him when she continued speaking. "The truth is that I never cared about moving up the way you meant it." She gestured toward the city below them, the calm movement of the water and the distant neighborhoods stretching beyond the skyline. "I only cared about building something that felt quiet enough to breathe in." Daniel looked back at the mansion behind them, the long driveway, the acres of land, and the endless view of Seattle below the hill. For the first time since arriving that morning, he realized that Emily Carter had not exaggerated when she described her life. She had simply described it differently than he understood. Daniel remained beside the stone railing for a long moment after Emily finished speaking, the quiet morning air carrying the distant sound of a ferry horn across Elliott Bay, while the city slowly came to life below them. The sunlight had climbed higher now, reflecting across the glass towers of downtown Seattle and stretching long lines of light over the water. From this hill, the entire skyline looked almost peaceful, like a painting someone had hung beyond the edge of the estate. Daniel folded his arms loosely, still trying to understand how the woman he once believed he knew so well had built a life that existed completely outside the world he measured success in. Emily picked up her coffee cup again and turned toward the house with an easy calm, as if nothing about the morning felt unusual to her at all. "You should come inside for a moment," she said gently. "You drove nearly 20 miles to get here." Daniel hesitated only briefly before following her up the final steps toward the wide glass doors. The interior of the house was bright and open, filled with soft natural light that poured through floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the bay. The space felt modern but comfortable, with warm wooden floors and shelves lined with books instead of the polished decorations Daniel expected to see in a mansion of this size. He noticed framed photographs along one wall showing landscapes, small coastal towns, and quiet forest trails. None of them were extravagant. They were simple moments captured in calm places. Emily set her coffee cup on the long kitchen island and walked toward the windows while Daniel slowly took in the room. "How long has Carter Holdings existed?" he finally asked. Emily leaned lightly against the counter. "Almost 8 years now." Daniel turned toward her in surprise. 8 years? That means you started it not long after." He stopped before finishing the sentence, but Emily understood exactly what he meant. Not long after their divorce. She nodded calmly. "Yes, around that time." Daniel let out a slow breath and walked a few steps closer to the windows, looking out toward the water again. "I thought you left the investment world when we separated," he admitted. Emily smiled faintly. "I did leave the world you knew, but that does not mean I stopped building something of my own." The words were simple, yet they carried a quiet certainty that Daniel had never heard from her during their marriage. Back then she had always tried to support his ambitions, adapting her own plans to fit the direction his career demanded. Now it was clear that somewhere along the way she had chosen a completely different path. Daniel rested his hands on the back of one of the chairs, still absorbing the reality around him. "You bought the coastal properties just to stop our project?" he asked after a moment. Emily shook her head gently. "No, the land was always part of a larger plan. The environmental group that manages the shoreline has been searching for a private partner willing to preserve most of the area while developing only a small portion of the coast. Carter Holdings agreed to fund that plan months ago." Daniel stared at her, realizing the implication. The resort project his firm hoped to build would have covered nearly the entire coastline. Emily's purchase had changed that future completely. She stepped toward the window beside him and looked out at the water where sunlight danced across the gentle waves. "You once told me that success meant owning the biggest view in the room," she said quietly. Daniel remembered the comment instantly. He had said it years ago during a business dinner when they were still married. Emily glanced around the bright, open house and then back toward the skyline below the hill. "I learned that sometimes the best view is the one you protect, not the one you take." Daniel stood there in silence, slowly realizing that the quiet life Emily described the night before had never been small at all. It had simply grown in a direction he never bothered to look. Daniel remained near the wide window for a long moment after Emily finished speaking, the quiet inside the house broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of wind moving through the cedar trees outside. The explanation she had just given settled slowly in his mind, rearranging years of assumptions one piece at a time. For most of his career, Daniel had believed the world moved according to a simple pattern. The loudest deals attracted the most respect, the tallest buildings symbolized the greatest success, and the people who stood closest to power were the ones who mattered. Yet standing inside Emily's home, surrounded by quiet light and calm spaces, he began to sense that she had built something entirely different. Emily walked to the far side of the kitchen island and poured herself a fresh cup of coffee from a stainless steel pot. The aroma filled the room with a warm scent that felt strangely grounding after the tension Daniel had carried since reading the property documents that morning. She glanced toward him with the same composed expression she had worn throughout the conversation. "You look like you were trying to solve a puzzle," she said gently. Daniel let out a small breath that was almost a laugh. "Maybe I am." He walked slowly across the wooden floor, stopping beside the long dining table that faced the windows overlooking Elliott Bay. From here the water seemed close enough to touch, and the sunlight shimmered across the surface like scattered silver coins. "I spent years thinking I understood the direction your life went after we separated," he admitted. "But none of this fits the picture I had in my mind." Emily rested one hand against the counter and considered his words for a moment. "The picture people carry about someone else's life is usually built from very little information," she replied quietly. Daniel nodded slowly. He could not deny the truth of that. After their divorce, he had heard occasional updates about Emily from mutual acquaintances, small fragments that painted a simple story. She moved away from their downtown apartment. She began working on smaller consulting projects. She preferred living outside the center of the city. Those details had sounded like signs of someone stepping away from ambition. Daniel had never questioned the conclusion. Now he realized that while he was chasing increasingly larger deals across the country, Emily had been building something steady and deliberate right here in Seattle. He glanced around the spacious room again, noticing a large wall map mounted near the far hallway. The map displayed several coastal areas of Washington state marked with small colored pins. "Those are the conservation properties you mentioned earlier," he said. Emily followed his gaze and nodded. "Most of them." Daniel stepped closer to the map, studying the pattern of locations. Some were forest reserves. Others appeared to be coastal wetlands or stretches of untouched shoreline. Each one carried a small handwritten note beside the pin describing restoration work or protected wildlife habitats. The realization settled into his thoughts with surprising clarity. Emily had not only invested in land. She had reshaped the future of those places. "You built an entire network of projects like this," Daniel said quietly. Emily gave a small nod. "Piece by piece. It took time." Daniel looked back toward the windows where the wide view of the bay stretched beneath the hillside. For the first time since arriving that morning, he felt the urgency of his own schedule fade slightly. The meeting he had planned with his firm later that afternoon suddenly seemed less important than understanding the quiet transformation that had taken place in Emily's life. He turned back toward her with a thoughtful expression. "I suppose I should have asked more questions last night," he said. Emily smiled faintly at that. "People usually ask questions that confirm what they already believe," she replied. Outside, the wind shifted across the water and sunlight moved slowly across the floor of the room. Daniel stood there in the calm space Emily had built for herself, realizing that the quiet life he once dismissed had been growing into something far more powerful than he ever imagined. Daniel remained standing near the wall map for several quiet seconds after Emily finished speaking, studying the colored pins that marked different stretches of coastline and forest across Washington state. Each small marker represented years of work that had taken place without headlines, without large announcements, and certainly without the kind of public recognition Daniel had spent most of his career chasing. He slowly traced the pattern of the locations with his eyes, realizing that the properties formed a loose chain along the Pacific coast and the inland waterways surrounding Seattle. Emily stepped closer beside him, holding her coffee cup with both hands. Her posture relaxed as if she were showing a friend a favorite travel map rather than the result of nearly a decade of quiet investment decisions. "You started all of this after the divorce," Daniel said finally, his voice thoughtful. Emily nodded once. "It gave me time to think about what I actually wanted to build." Daniel remembered the months leading up to their separation with surprising clarity. Back then his calendar had been packed with business dinners, conferences in different cities, and meetings that stretched late into the night. Emily had often waited for him to return home, sitting by the window of their downtown apartment while the lights of Seattle flickered across the glass towers outside. At the time, Daniel believed he was working toward a shared future, building a life that would eventually give them both everything they needed. But standing inside her home now, he understood that the path he had chosen never truly allowed space for the quieter vision she carried. He turned slightly toward her. "Why did you choose conservation projects?" he asked. Emily walked to the window again and looked out toward the water where a ferry was slowly crossing the bay. "Because land remembers what we do with it," she said calmly. "Most people see property as something to develop or sell. I wanted to see what would happen if someone invested in protecting it instead." Daniel considered that idea in silence. For years he had evaluated land almost entirely through numbers, calculating potential profit margins and construction costs the way a mathematician solves equations. Emily had approached the same resource with an entirely different perspective. She had treated land like something living, something worth preserving even when no one was watching. He leaned against the edge of the table, still absorbing the shift in understanding that had unfolded since he arrived at the estate. "The reunion last night," he said slowly. "You must have known I would eventually hear about the coastal purchase." Emily gave a small nod. "Yes." Daniel looked at her carefully. "Then why come at all?" Emily paused for a moment before answering. The sunlight through the windows cast a soft glow across the room, reflecting faintly off the wooden floor. "Because sometimes it is important to see how people remember you," she said quietly. And sometimes it is important to see how much they have not noticed. Daniel thought about the laughter around the reunion table when she said she lived quietly. At the time he believed the comment proved that she had chosen a smaller life. Now the memory felt different, almost uncomfortable in its simplicity. Emily took another sip of her coffee and glanced toward the map again. The funny thing about quiet work, she continued gently, is that it often grows much larger than the things people talk about the most. Outside, the wind shifted across the water again, and sunlight brightened the distant skyline. Daniel looked around the spacious room, the peaceful estate, and the wide stretch of protected land marked on the map. For the first time he realized that the woman he once believed had stepped away from ambition had actually been building something far more lasting than the deals he spent years chasing. Daniel remained by the window for a while after Emily finished speaking, watching the slow movement of boats across Elliott Bay while the morning sunlight continued to brighten the wide glass walls of the house. The quiet inside the room felt different now, less like silence and more like space for thoughts that had been ignored for too long. Emily walked calmly toward the far side of the living room where a sliding glass door opened onto a large terrace that overlooked the hillside. When she stepped outside, the cool ocean breeze followed her back into the house, carrying the faint scent of salt water and pine trees from the forest that stretched along the property. Daniel hesitated for a moment before following her onto the terrace. From there, the estate revealed even more of its scale. The infinity pool extended along the edge of the hill like a sheet of glass reflecting the sky, and beyond it terraced gardens descended gradually toward a private path that led down to the shoreline, nearly 200 yards below. The view was quiet and expansive in a way that made the entire city look distant. Emily rested her hands lightly on the railing and looked out toward the horizon as if she had done it 1,000 times before. Daniel stood beside her, still trying to measure the life she had built against the memory he carried from the past. "When we separated," he said slowly, "I thought you wanted to step away from everything." Emily glanced at him briefly, her expression calm but thoughtful. "In a way I did," she replied. "Just not from the things you imagined." Daniel leaned against the railing and looked down at the gardens below. Rows of tall grasses moved gently in the wind, and small stone paths curved through the landscape toward the lower terraces. Everything had been designed to feel natural, as if the house had simply grown from the hillside rather than being placed there. "I used to believe success meant building something bigger every year," Daniel admitted. "Bigger companies, bigger projects, bigger headlines." Emily listened quietly without interrupting. Daniel looked back toward the skyline where the towers of downtown Seattle rose above the water. "But the way you describe it," he continued, "it sounds like you were building something slower." Emily smiled faintly. "Slow things tend to last longer," she said. The wind brushed lightly across the terrace again, and the surface of the pool rippled softly beneath the sunlight. Daniel folded his arms, thinking about the coastal land his firm had planned to develop. Months of negotiations, architectural proposals, and investment strategies had been built around that project. Yet Emily had quietly acquired the property overnight without making a single announcement. He turned toward her again with a curious expression. "Your company could have easily turned that land into another luxury resort," he said. "The profit alone would have been enormous." Emily nodded once. "Yes, it would have." Daniel waited for her to continue. She looked out toward the distant water before answering. "But some places are more valuable when they remain exactly as they are." Daniel considered the idea carefully. In his world, value had always been measured by the price someone was willing to pay. Emily had built an entire company around a different definition. After a moment, he asked the question that had been forming quietly in his mind since arriving at the estate. "Did you ever think about telling me?" Emily turned slightly, meeting his eyes with the same calm expression she had carried throughout the morning. "About Carter Holdings?" she asked. Daniel nodded. Emily paused before answering, the breeze moving a few strands of hair across her face. "No," she said softly, "because the person you were back then would not have believed it mattered." Daniel looked out across the hillside again, realizing how much of Emily's life had unfolded beyond the limits of the world he once assumed was the only one that counted. Daniel remained leaning against the terrace railing after Emily spoke, the cool wind moving quietly across the hillside, while the city below continued its ordinary rhythm far beyond the calm boundaries of the estate. Cars moved. Like small silver threads along the distant highways, and ferries crossed the water in slow, steady lines. But up here, everything felt separated from that constant motion. For the first time since arriving, Daniel allowed himself to stop measuring the morning in terms of meetings, deadlines, and decisions waiting at his office. Emily stood beside him with the same calm presence she had carried throughout the conversation, her gaze resting on the horizon where the pale blue sky met the darker water of the bay. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, yet it carried the weight of many years that neither of them had fully examined until now. Daniel finally straightened and rested his hands along the smooth wooden railing. "Last night I thought you were being modest," he said slowly, "when you said you lived quietly." Emily glanced at him with a faint smile that did not contain judgment or pride. "I was being honest," she replied. Daniel nodded once, realizing how easily honesty can be misunderstood when people expect something different. For most of his career, he had associated quiet lives with limited ambition, with people who chose stability instead of growth. But standing here on the edge of Emily's estate, surrounded by acres of protected land and the work of an entire investment network, he understood that quiet could also mean deliberate, patient, and deeply intentional. He looked down the hillside again toward the private path that curved through the gardens and disappeared among tall cedar trees nearly 200 yards away. "Your company has been doing this for 8 years, he said thoughtfully. "Acquiring land, protecting coastlines, working with conservation groups. And nobody in my world even noticed." Emily shrugged lightly. "That was never the goal." Daniel studied her expression. Most investors would want recognition for something this large. Emily leaned forward slightly against the railing, the wind brushing across the terrace again. "Recognition is loud," she said gently, "but impact does not always need to be." Daniel considered the difference between those two ideas. In his industry, recognition often determined opportunity. The people whose names appeared in financial headlines attracted the biggest investors and the most ambitious partnerships. Yet Emily had quietly assembled resources powerful enough to redirect an entire development project without anyone anticipating it. He thought about the coastal land again, the negotiations his firm had celebrated only days before believing the deal was nearly complete. Emily had never confronted them publicly, never announced her purchase as a challenge. She simply bought the land and changed the outcome. Daniel exhaled slowly, realizing the subtle elegance of that decision. "You could have made a fortune developing that shoreline," he said. Emily nodded. "Yes. But instead you stopped the project." Emily looked out across the water again before answering. "I did not stop it," she said calmly. "I redirected it." Daniel raised his eyebrows slightly. Emily continued in the same quiet tone. "A small research center will be built near the northern edge of the coast. It will support marine scientists studying the migration patterns of whales and salmon. The rest of the land will remain protected." Daniel listened carefully, picturing the difference between the towering resort his firm had imagined and the modest research facility Emily described. The contrast felt almost symbolic of the choices they had made years ago when their lives began moving in different directions. He turned to face her again. "You built something that will still matter decades from now," he said quietly. Emily gave a small, thoughtful nod, but did not respond immediately. Instead, she looked toward the distant skyline of Seattle, where the tallest buildings reflected sunlight across the bay. "Time has a way of revealing what truly matters," she said softly. Daniel followed her gaze toward the city, understanding that the morning had changed more than just his perception of Emily's life. It had quietly reshaped the way he understood his own. Daniel remained beside the terrace railing as the morning continued to unfold across the bay, the sunlight now brighter and higher in the sky, spreading a soft glow across the hillside and the quiet gardens below. For several minutes, neither he nor Emily spoke. The conversation had reached a place where words seemed less necessary, replaced by the quiet understanding that had slowly formed between them throughout the morning. Daniel watched a white ferry crossing the water far below, its slow, steady movement reminding him how small the city looked from this distance. When he finally turned back toward Emily, his expression had changed slightly, as if the weight he carried earlier had settled into something calmer and more reflective. "There is something I keep thinking about," he said thoughtfully. Emily looked at him with quiet attention, her hands resting lightly along the wooden railing. "What is that?" she asked. Daniel took a moment before answering. Last night at the reunion, I believed I was seeing your life clearly, he said. I thought you had stepped away from ambition and chosen something smaller. Emily listened without interrupting. Daniel continued, his voice steady but more introspective than before. Now I realize I was only seeing the part of your life that was visible from the outside. Emily gave a small nod of acknowledgement. That happens more often than people realize, she replied gently. Daniel glanced once more at the skyline of Seattle stretching across the water. In my world, success is always visible, he said. It appears in news articles, financial reports, and announcements. If something matters, everyone talks about it. Emily smiled faintly at that description. And if something does not appear there, she asked. Daniel looked back at the estate around them, the quiet terraces, the acres of land preserved beyond the trees, and the company that had quietly redirected an entire development project without attracting attention. Then people assume it does not exist, he admitted. Emily lifted her coffee cup and took a small sip before placing it back on the railing. That assumption gives quiet work the freedom to grow, she said calmly. Daniel thought about those words carefully. He had spent decades building a career that depended on visibility, competition, and constant movement toward larger opportunities. Emily had built something powerful by doing the opposite, by moving patiently and deliberately while the rest of the world looked somewhere else. After a moment, he asked another question that had been forming quietly in his mind. What will happen to the coastal project now? Emily turned slightly toward the water again. The research center construction begins later this year, she explained. Marine biologists from 3 universities have already agreed to collaborate on the program. They will study migration patterns, coastal ecosystems, and long-term environmental changes. Daniel listened closely. And Carter Holdings will fund all of that. Emily nodded. Yes, the company was built for projects like this. Daniel folded his arms thoughtfully. The scale of the plan surprised him again, not because it was dramatic, but because it was purposeful in a way that many commercial projects rarely were. He imagined the shoreline remaining largely untouched, the quiet presence of researchers replacing the towering resort structures his firm once envisioned. After a moment, he gave a small, thoughtful smile. You redirected the future of that entire coastline, he said. Emily did not respond immediately. Instead, she watched the slow movement of sunlight across the water for several seconds before speaking softly. I simply gave the land a chance to remain what it already was. Daniel stood beside her in silence again, the breeze moving gently across the terrace while the distant city carried on with its busy morning. For the first time, he understood that the quiet life Emily described had never been about stepping away from the world. It had been about shaping it in a way that most people never thought to notice. Daniel stood quietly on the terrace beside Emily as the morning sun climbed higher above Seattle, casting long golden reflections across Elliott Bay while the city continued its steady rhythm in the distance. From this height, the movement of the world seemed softer, almost slower, as if the hillside estate existed just outside the constant urgency of downtown streets and office towers. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. The conversation they had shared throughout the morning had already shifted something important between them, replacing the assumptions of the past with a clearer understanding that felt both unexpected and strangely peaceful. Daniel rested his hands lightly along the wooden railing, feeling the smooth surface beneath his palms while the cool breeze moved across the hill. When we were married, he said quietly, I used to believe that success was something you had to chase constantly. Emily turned her head slightly, listening without interrupting. Daniel continued, his voice thoughtful and calm. Every deal had to be bigger than the last one. Every year had to look more impressive than the year before. I thought that if I slowed down for even a moment, everything would pass me by. Emily gave a faint smile, not dismissive but understanding. Many people believe that, she said gently. Daniel looked out toward the skyline again, where the glass towers of downtown Seattle reflected the late morning light. But standing here today, I realize something strange, he added. Emily waited quietly. Daniel glanced back toward the long gardens descending the hillside, the protected forest beyond the property line, and the calm stretch of coastline visible far across the bay. You never chased any of that, he said. You built something steady instead. Emily lifted her coffee cup again, now nearly empty, and held it thoughtfully for a moment before setting it down on the terrace railing. Chasing things can make people forget why they wanted them in the first place, she replied softly. Daniel considered those words carefully. During the years after their divorce, he had told himself that Emily would eventually regret stepping away from the ambitious life he had planned for them. He imagined she would see his growing career and realize what she had given up. Yet the reality in front of him was entirely different. Emily had not stepped away from ambition. She had simply redefined it in a way that never required approval from the world he lived in. Daniel exhaled slowly and straightened from the railing. The truth is, he admitted after a moment, I came here this morning expecting something completely different. Emily looked at him with quiet curiosity. What did you expect? She asked. Daniel gave a small, thoughtful laugh. I expected to confront a misunderstanding. Maybe even prove that the property documents were wrong. Emily's eyes softened slightly, understanding the honesty in his voice. Daniel looked across the estate again, taking in the wide terraces, the glass walls of the house, and the calm view of water stretching far toward the horizon. Instead, I discovered that the life I thought you were living never existed at all, he said quietly. Emily rested both hands on the railing beside her and glanced once more toward the city skyline. Sometimes the most important things grow outside the places people are looking, she replied. Daniel nodded slowly, recognizing the truth of that statement. The morning breeze moved across the hillside again, carrying the distant scent of the ocean while sunlight shimmered across the surface of the bay below them. Standing there beside Emily, Daniel finally understood something that had been hidden from him for years. The quiet life he once believed was small had actually been powerful enough to reshape the future of an entire coastline without ever needing to announce itself. Daniel remained beside the terrace railing for several quiet moments after his last words faded into the soft movement of the wind across the hillside. The morning had slowly transformed into early afternoon, and the sunlight now stretched farther across the bay, painting the surface of the water in long shimmering patterns. From the estate, the city of Seattle still looked distant and almost peaceful, its tall buildings rising quietly above the shoreline, while the steady motion of ferries continued across the water. Daniel watched that distant movement with a calmer mind than he had carried when he first arrived earlier that morning. The urgency that usually shaped his days had gradually faded, replaced by a quiet awareness of how different Emily's world had become from the one they once shared. Emily stood beside him with the same composed presence she had carried throughout the conversation, her hands resting lightly on the railing while she observed the horizon with quiet familiarity. After a moment, Daniel spoke again, his voice thoughtful and steady. When we separated, I believed I understood the direction our lives would take, he said. Emily turned slightly toward him, listening without interruption. Daniel continued slowly, choosing his words with more care than he once would have. I thought I would continue building larger deals and larger companies, and eventually the distance between our lives would confirm that I had chosen the stronger path. Emily's expression remained calm, but there was a quiet kindness in her eyes as she listened. Daniel gave a small, thoughtful breath before finishing the thought. But standing here today, I realized something different. The distance between our lives did grow. It just did not grow the way I expected. Emily glanced toward the gardens that stretched down the hillside and the protected trees beyond them. Time reveals many things people do not notice at first, she said softly. Daniel nodded slowly, recognizing the truth in that simple statement. For years he had measured success through constant motion and visible achievement, believing that the loudest accomplishments would eventually define the value of his work. Yet Emily had spent those same years building something quiet enough that he never even noticed it until it intersected directly with his own plans. Daniel rested his arms along the railing again and looked toward the distant coastline far beyond the bay. Somewhere along that shore, the land his firm once hoped to develop was now part of Emily's network of protected properties. The realization carried no anger now, only a quiet sense of clarity. Your company changed the future of that coastline, he said after a moment. Emily gave a gentle shake of her head. The future was always there, she replied calmly. I only helped it remain possible. Daniel considered the difference between those two ideas. In his world, people often believed they were shaping the future through expansion and construction. Emily had chosen to shape it by allowing certain places to remain untouched. The thought carried a quiet power that Daniel could not ignore. He straightened slightly and looked around the estate once more, noticing the peaceful order of the gardens, the soft lines of the terrace, and the endless view stretching toward the horizon. "You built something meaningful," he said quietly. Emily's faint smile returned, but this time it carried a deeper sense of peace rather than accomplishment. "Meaningful things do not always need attention," she replied. The wind moved gently across the hillside again, and sunlight reflected across the windows of the house behind them. Daniel realized then that the morning had not only revealed Emily's life to him, it had quietly changed the way he would measure his own from that day forward. Daniel stood quietly on the terrace as the afternoon light slowly softened across Elliott Bay, the sun beginning its gradual descent toward the distant horizon while the city below continued its steady rhythm without ever realizing how much had changed on the hillside above it. The wind moved gently through the tall cedar trees surrounding the estate, carrying the quiet sound of rustling branches and the faint scent of salt from the ocean air. For a long moment Daniel simply looked out across the view, allowing the silence to settle naturally between himself and Emily. When he had arrived that morning, he believed he was coming to confront a misunderstanding, perhaps even defend his pride after discovering the unexpected name on the property documents. Instead, he found himself standing in a place that quietly revealed how little he had truly understood about the woman who once shared his life. Emily remained beside the railing with the same calm composure she had shown all day, her gaze resting on the distant water where sunlight now shimmered in softer golden tones. Daniel finally spoke, his voice carrying none of the sharp certainty that once defined it. "I should probably head back soon," he said thoughtfully. Emily turned slightly toward him and gave a small, understanding nod. "You have meetings waiting," she said gently. Daniel smiled faintly. "Yes, they never seem to stop." For a moment he looked back toward the house behind them, the wide glass windows reflecting the sky and the long terraces that stepped quietly down the hillside. Everything about the place carried a sense of deliberate peace, as if the estate had been built not to impress anyone, but simply to exist in harmony with the landscape around it. Daniel realized that the calm he felt here had nothing to do with wealth or status. It came from something far more intentional. He turned back toward Emily and spoke again, this time with quiet sincerity. "For what it is worth," he said slowly, "I am glad I came here today." Emily studied his expression for a moment before responding. "So am I," she said. Daniel gave a small, thoughtful breath and glanced one last time at the wide view stretching across the bay. "You built something remarkable," he added. Emily shook her head gently, her voice calm and steady. "I built something that feels right." The simplicity of that answer lingered in the quiet air between them. After another moment, Daniel stepped back from the railing and walked toward the path that led down the driveway, where his car waited near the gate. Emily remained on the terrace, watching as he paused briefly halfway across the stone steps and turned to look back once more at the house, the gardens, and the endless horizon beyond the water. For the first time in many years, Daniel Brooks understood that success did not always announce itself with headlines or applause. Sometimes it grew quietly in the background of the world, shaping the future while everyone else was looking somewhere else. He gave Emily a small respectful nod before continuing down the path toward the waiting gate. The iron doors slowly opened as he approached, revealing the winding road that led back toward the busy city below. As Daniel drove away from the hillside estate, he carried with him a realization that would stay far longer than the memory of any business deal. Emily Carter had never needed to prove anything to the world that once underestimated her. She simply built a life strong enough that one day the truth would reveal itself without a single word.